Now, Simone de Beauvoir, undisputedly one of the most influential intellectuals of the 20th century, however, recently released personal diaries and letters to her lovers offer a whole new light to this philosopher, writer and feminist. De Beauvoir's autobiographies, it appears, may have hidden quite a bit about her own philosophical beginnings, her triumphs, failures and her relationships. Well, philosopher and author Kate Kirkpatrick, who has just published a new book, Becoming Beauvoir, joins us now. Miss Kirkpatrick, thanks so much for your time. Can I start by just asking you more about these letters and diaries? How were they released, and is that what sparked you to write a new biography about de Beauvoir?
Well, what sparked me to write a new biography about Beauvoir, I suppose, is difficult to isolate in a single moment, because I did my doctorate on the philosophy of Jean-Paul Sartre, especially his early philosophy up to being in nothingness. And I found many influences on his philosophy that were not very studied in the English language. And so when Beauvoir's Cahiers de Jeunesse, her student diaries, were published in French in 2008, I think some academics studied them for the philosophical content that they had, but I think what they show is that actually before Beauvoir even met Sartre, she was concerned with similar philosophical questions that became famous for being existentialist questions. So it was actually the philosophical originality in this very early Beauvoir text that made me think the story of her life might be worth reconsidering. And then when her letters to Claude Lanzmann were sold to Yale last year, that was an additional news source, I thought, that would contribute to a kind of reevaluation.
Indeed, and all these recent texts, they do seem to offer a new light to Simone de Beauvoir. And one thing that it looks like her autobiographies kind of hid a lot of her triumphs. And, for someone who is now, an icon of feminism, that seems quite surprising. How do you see it?
So I think it is surprising, and it's perplexed scholars working on Beauvoir for quite some time. It's actually angered many feminists. Why would this groundbreaking woman conceal her own ingenuity and her own contributions? But I think that Beauvoir had a very sophisticated approach to literature, and I almost wonder whether autobiography is the right classification for what she was doing in the texts that we call her autobiographies, because I think she had quite a political motivation in writing them, which was to help other women see the kinds of ways that becoming a woman is constrained by certain social expectations. So she didn't promise to keep the autobiographical pact, to tell her reader everything or the whole truth and nothing but the truth. She said explicitly that there were some inevitable omissions.
Indeed, there were
and
her
I think just now we're starting to understand.
Indeed, her philosophical reflections on her becoming and her work in general. Many debate whether she was an author, philosopher. But you mentioned there as well Claude Lanzmann, and they are the latest letters we got were on this lover across in the US, and that's put into question this whole relationship with Jean-Paul Sartre, which has dominated much of what we read about Simone de Beauvoir.
Yes, and I think the student diaries also show new light into that, because in the account of the famous Pacte du Louvre, we have this story of people who met each other and immediately occupied an unparalleled place in each other's lives. And there's a sense in which that's true, because intellectually they continue to be each other's critics and to be the kind of the iron that sharpens intellectual iron for 51 years. But the romantic nature of the relationship is widely misunderstood. It was deeply dissatisfying to her on several fronts. And so I think the romantic relationship actually ended much sooner than most people think.
Do you think, just briefly, that it's fair that all these, what she personally had decided to keep private, that they've now been made public?
So this is a disturbing question for a biographer. So in Beauvoir's Cahiers de Jeunesse, her student notebooks, there was a note that she wrote saying that it's a kind of violation to read what is written on these pages. And I think the reason that I feel that it is a worthwhile thing to do is because this is a woman whose intellectual contribution to 20th century thought is just immense. I mean, the second sex shaped feminist movements around the world. Her own philosophy shaped existentialism. And I think that the story of her life has a lot to tell us about how women's lives are represented. And so it's still worth looking into the details.
Indeed, and I've heard you say before that, biographies offer us, a reflection on the world we live in. And indeed, reading Becoming Beauvoir, we see that many of the things that Beauvoir struggled with in becoming who she wanted to be compared to who she should be because of society, they're very much still alive today, many of the arguments in this book.
Absolutely. I think, this is one of the things that I found fascinating when I was doing the research for the book. And I think one of the reasons that other readers have found it interesting is because Beauvoir was constantly accused of being out of date because she thought feminism was still relevant. She faced the accusation in 1949. She faced it in the 60s when she published Les Belles Images. When she was trying to say, let's look at the world from women's point of view, let's hear what women have to say, critics would say, this is boring, this is irrelevant. But it's much of what women had to say in 1949 and in the 1960s is similar to the problems that women still face.
And indeed, I have to say, reading it myself, I think it's still very relevant in 2019. Ms. Kate Kirkpatrick, thanks so much for taking time out to tell us a bit more about the background to your biography, Becoming Beauvoir.